The lake had always been Daniel Carter's refuge. Nestled at the far edge of Millstone Ridge, his property stretched down to a private dock he'd built with his own hands. That dock wasn't just wood and nails, it was freedom. After years of working overtime shifts at the mechanic shop, this place was his payoff. That Saturday evening, golden light spilled over the water as Daniel's guests arrived. Mark and Lisa, old friends from college, carried a cooler and a blanket. Laughter floated through the air as they set up a picnic spot just off the dock. Carl Benson, Daniel's neighbor and closest ally in the ongoing battle with the HOA, leaned against his old pickup truck, watching with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd seen too many fights and finally found peace. "Good spot you got here, Danny," Carl said, tipping his veteran's cap toward the lake. Daniel grinned. "Best part of owning land, Carl. Nobody can tell us when or how to enjoy it. At least, that's how it should have been." But peace never lasted long in Millstone Ridge, not with the HOA breathing down everyone's neck. Daniel had tangled with them before over mailbox colors, lawn lengths, and even the shade of curtains in his front windows. Still, nothing prepared him for what was coming. As Mark cracked open a drink and Lisa spread out food, Daniel leaned back on his bike, taking in the view. The lake shimmered like glass, and for a moment, it felt untouchable. He didn't know Karen was already on her way, clipboard in hand, face pinched with that permanent scowl. The evening calm was about to shatter. Karen arrived like a storm front, predictable, inevitable, and unwelcome. She strode down the gravel path with her clipboard clutched tight to her chest, her pastel cardigan glowing against the fading sun. Daniel noticed her before anyone else. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He had learned that with Karen, reacting too fast only gave her more fire. "Here we go," Carl muttered from the truck, his voice gravelly, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his veteran's cap. Mark looked up from the picnic blanket. "Friend of yours?" he asked, half joking. "Not even close," Daniel replied. Karen's sneakers crunched on the gravel until she stopped dead at the edge of the dock, eyes darting from the guests to the cooler and finally locking onto Daniel. "Mr. Carter," she began, her tone clipped and sharp. "You know very well that the lake is common property for Millstone Ridge residents. Your guests have no right to be here." Daniel stayed leaned against his bike, arms crossed. "This dock," he said slowly, "sits on my land. My guests are standing on my grass. That cooler isn't hurting anyone." Karen's nostrils flared. She lifted her clipboard like it was a weapon. "The HOA rules clearly state." Carl cut her off, his deep voice rumbling across the clearing. "Rules don't trump deeds, lady. Danny owns this dock. That lake access is his." Karen's eyes narrowed into slits. For a moment, Daniel thought she might back down. But if there was one thing he knew about her, it was that she never surrendered ground, not without a fight. Her next move would define the evening. The space between them stretched taut, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. Daniel's calm stare met Karen's icy glare, and for a few seconds, no one moved. Even the lake seemed to hold its breath. "You think you can ignore the HOA, Mr. Carter?" Karen's voice carried, sharp as glass. "We have regulations for a reason. That dock extends into shared waters. You cannot just host parties and disrupt the peace." Daniel didn't flinch. "This isn't a party, Karen. It's 3 friends sharing dinner by the water. And that dock? Built squarely on my deeded land. I checked the survey lines myself." Karen's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. "We'll see what the board has to say about this." From the truck, Carl barked a laugh. "The board? Half of them are scared of you, and the other half don't know the law from a hole in the ground. Danny's right, you're out of bounds." Lisa, sensing the tension, placed a hand on Mark's arm. "Should we pack up?" she whispered. Daniel shook his head just slightly. "Stay put. You're not doing anything wrong." Karen scribbled something onto her clipboard, the pen jabbing at the paper like each mark was a punishment. "This will be documented. You're facing fines, Mr. Carter. And if you don't comply, we'll escalate." Daniel finally straightened, stepping closer. His boots crunched on the gravel. "Karen," he said evenly, "you've overstepped before, but this is different. This is my land. My dock, and my guests are welcome here any time I say so. The words landed like stones in still water. Karen froze, pin hovering midair. She wasn't used to resistance this firm, certainly not in front of witnesses. The sun slipped lower, shadows stretching. The standoff was far from over. The air grew heavier as twilight deepened, painting the lake in streaks of orange and purple. The sharp cry of a bird echoed across the water, the only sound in the silence that followed Daniel's words. Karen's grip on her clipboard tightened until her knuckles turned white. She was rattled, though she tried to mask it behind a stiff posture and a raised chin. "You're making a mistake," she finally said, voice lower, though no less sharp. "Defying the HOA never ends well." Daniel stepped closer, his shadow stretching long across the gravel. "What you call defiance, I call standing my ground. I bought this land fair and square. No committee gets to decide who I can share it with." Carl chuckled, shaking his head. "Karen, you've picked the wrong hill to die on." Mark exchanged a glance with Lisa. Neither spoke, but their nervous shifting spoke volumes. Guests weren't supposed to be part of neighborhood wars, yet here they were, caught in the middle of one. Karen inhaled deeply through her nose, as if centering herself. Then she wrote another furious note on her clipboard. "Fine," she said. "But when you get that fine in your mailbox, remember this conversation." Daniel's lips curved in the faintest of smirks. "I'll remember it all right. And I'll be ready." Karen turned on her heel, sneakers grinding the gravel as she stormed back toward the subdivision. The pastel pink of her cardigan vanished into the shadows of the path. Carl pushed off his truck, crossing the distance with a grin. "Hell of a stand you just made, Danny. But you know she won't quit. She'll be back with backup." Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes on the fading glow of the lake. "I know. This was just the first shot." By the time the stars began to peek through the indigo sky, Mark and Lisa had quietly packed up and left, their goodbyes short and uneasy. They hadn't signed up for a showdown, and Daniel didn't blame them. Now it was just him and Carl. The lake lapped gently at the dock, ripples catching the last streaks of fading light. Carl lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the lines of age and battles on his face. "You know she'll double down, right? Karen doesn't lose gracefully." Daniel nodded, resting his hands on the Harley's handlebars. "I know. She's probably already planning her next move." Carl exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "Thing is, Danny, she's scared of you. I saw it. She froze when you said it was your land. For once, she didn't have a comeback." Daniel allowed himself a small smile. "That's the truth. She can't fight. The deed is mine. No HOA vote. No clipboard. No fine changes that." But even as he said it, Daniel felt the weight of what was coming. Karen wasn't the type to stop. The HOA wasn't built on reason. It was built on control. And people like Karen thrived on it. The night was still, but Daniel's gut churned. This was only the beginning. Carl flicked ash into the gravel. "You're ready for what's next?" Daniel looked out at the dark water, the reflection of the stars trembling on the surface. His jaw set. "Yeah, let her bring whatever she's got. I won't back down." The words hung heavy in the night air. The lake was calm, but war was coming. By morning, Daniel's gut feeling had proven right. Trouble came knocking early. From his driveway, he spotted Karen on the opposite curb with two board members in tow, her reinforcements. Both were middle-aged men in neat polo shirts and khakis, standing stiffly as if their clipboards were shields. Karen pointed toward Daniel's property, her voice carrying across the street. "There he is. I told you he was using the lake for unauthorized gatherings." Daniel crossed the asphalt slowly, shoulders squared, his boots striking the pavement with quiet confidence. Carl watched from his truck, arms folded, his expression a mixture of grim amusement and loyalty. When Daniel reached them, Karen wasted no time. "Mr. Carter, this is official HOA business. Your guests yesterday were in violation of common property rules. You will be receiving a written citation." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Yesterday, my friends stood on my grass and my dock. Everything we did was on my land. You know that." One of the board members cleared his throat. "The lake is technically common access." Daniel cut him off, pulling a folded survey map from his back pocket. He had carried it ever since building the dock, anticipating exactly this fight. He unfolded it in front of them, jabbing his finger at the marked boundary lines. My deed extends 20 feet past the shoreline. That dock, and the slice of lake it touches, is mine. That's not HOA land. The men exchanged uncertain glances. Karen, however, refused to yield. Her eyes blazed. We'll contest that. We'll take it higher if we have to. Daniel folded the map calmly. Take it wherever you want. The facts won't change. Karen's lips pressed thin, but the fire in her eyes promised she wasn't done. The board members shifted uncomfortably, as though caught between a roaring fire and a flood. Karen's words snapped through the air, sharp and indignant. You think you're clever, waving a piece of paper around. But the HOA has authority. You can't just challenge us. Daniel held the map steady at his side, his voice even. Authority stops at the property line. That's the law. And unless you've got a new deed hidden in that clipboard, this conversation's over. Carl chuckled from his truck. She hates it when you're right, Danny. One of the board members finally spoke, his tone uncertain. Maybe we should consult with the county clerk before pursuing further action. If his deed says. Karen whipped her head toward him, eyes like daggers. Don't side with him. She snapped the words so harshly that both men fell silent, visibly shrinking back. Daniel tucked the survey map back into his pocket and leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice so only Karen could hear. You're not fighting me. You're fighting the truth. And truth doesn't lose. For the first time, Karen faltered. Her jaw worked, searching for a retort, but nothing came. Instead, she turned abruptly, waving her clipboard like a flag of dismissal. This isn't over. Not even close. The board members trailed after her as she stormed up the sidewalk, muttering under her breath. Daniel stood there, letting the quiet return. Carl sauntered over, shaking his head. She's boiling mad. You embarrassed her in front of her soldiers. That's gonna sting. Daniel exhaled. Good. Maybe it'll make her think twice. But both men knew the truth. Karen wasn't the type to think twice. She'd only dig deeper. The war had only begun. Later that afternoon, Daniel tried to focus on normal life, tuning up his Harley in the garage, rag in hand, grease under his fingernails. But the sound of deliberate footsteps outside the driveway pulled him from his thoughts. There she was again. Karen. Clipboard clutched to her chest, eyes darting between Daniel's house, the garage, and the street as if cataloging every detail. Daniel wiped his hands slowly, leaning against the workbench. Taking notes for your novel, Karen? She didn't flinch. Documenting violations. Carl, who had wandered over from across the street, barked a laugh. Violations? He's wiping grease off a bike, not running an underground casino. Karen ignored Carl, scribbling furiously. Unapproved modifications to property can result in citations. Daniel stepped forward, voice calm but edged. This garage is mine. This bike is mine. And none of it falls under your authority. Karen finally met his eyes, her stare like cold steel. We'll see. You think you're above the rules, but the HOA always wins. Carl muttered. Lady, you're barking up the wrong damn tree. Karen snapped her clipboard shut and walked briskly away, pastel pink sweater glowing in the sun. Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. She's pushing harder every day. Carl's eyes followed her retreat. Yeah, and it's only going to get uglier. The storm clouds were building. That evening, Daniel and Carl sat by the lake, beers sweating in the warm air. The water rippled softly, reflecting streaks of orange and gold. From the dock, the world felt peaceful. If only they could forget the war brewing on shore. Carl tipped back his drink, then said, You know she won't stop until she gets what she wants. Daniel nodded grimly. I know, but what she wants isn't hers to take. Carl leaned forward. Then you've got to be ready to fight back. Paperwork, evidence, witnesses. She'll twist the rules, call emergency meetings, maybe even drag this into court. Daniel stared out at the horizon. He had never been a man who enjoyed confrontation, but he wasn't one to run either. Then we'll meet her at every step. If she wants a fight, she's got one. Carl smirked. That's the spirit. Just don't underestimate her. People like Karen, they thrive on control. It's an addiction. Daniel's gaze shifted. On the path above the shoreline, A familiar silhouette lingered, the bob haircut, the pink cardigan, the ever-present clipboard. Karen stood half-hidden, pretending to check something on the path, but clearly spying. Daniel let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. She really can't help herself. Carl raised his bottle in a mock toast toward her shadowy figure. To the queen of nosy neighbors. Karen turned abruptly and vanished into the neighborhood. Daniel's jaw set. She's plotting something. I can feel it. The lake shimmered, but the air carried an edge of unease. Night settled heavy and quiet, the lake mirroring 1,000 stars. Daniel stood at the end of the dock, the cool air brushing against his face. His Harley gleamed faintly under the moonlight, a silent guardian of the land he refused to surrender. Carl joined him, hands stuffed into his flannel pockets. For a while, they just stood there in silence, letting the night wash over them. Finally, Carl spoke. You realize this ain't just about a dock anymore. This is about her proving she owns you. Daniel's jaw tightened. She doesn't own me. She doesn't own this land. She can try all she wants, but I'll never bow to her. Carl nodded slowly. Good. Just keep that fire, because she's coming back harder. Daniel looked out at the black water. He could almost see Karen's face in his mind, tight with indignation, lips pursed, eyes blazing with that need for control. She already lost once, Daniel said quietly. That's why she's dangerous now. She'll do anything not to lose again. Carl's voice dropped. Then you need to be ready for war. The words hung heavy in the night air, mixing with the sound of rippling water. Daniel straightened, resolve sharpening inside him. I am. Whatever she brings, I'll be ready. The stars shimmered above, distant and cold, as the two men stood watch over a property that was more than land. It was a line in the sand. The lake was calm, but the battle was only heating up. The lakeside, once peaceful, had turned into a battlefield of words. Daniel stood at the edge of the dock, his posture calm but commanding. The fading light painted the water in fiery streaks, mirroring the storm in the air. Karen, clipboard clutched like a weapon, marched forward with her two board members close behind. Her voice carried across the water, sharp and bitter. You've ignored every notice, Daniel. Every warning. This property is under HOA jurisdiction, and your little lake gatherings end tonight. Her words were meant to intimidate, but Daniel didn't move. He simply let the silence hang for a moment, the sound of frogs and crickets filling the gap. Finally, he spoke, his tone steady, almost too calm. This isn't your lake. This isn't your land. You've overstepped for the last time. Karen's face flushed, caught between indignation and hesitation. Carl leaned against his truck in the distance, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Mark and Lisa froze mid-picnic, watching with the unease of spectators at a duel. The board members shifted nervously, clearly unsure if their authority stretched this far. Karen, however, refused to back down. Her finger jabbed toward Daniel's dock as though she could erase him with a gesture. You think you can just defy the association? She spat. We'll see how bold you are when the sheriff shows up. Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his back pocket, his deed. This isn't bold, he said, holding it up. This is ownership. The word struck harder than any shout. Karen's eyes locked on the document, and for the first time, her confidence cracked. Daniel's hand was steady as he unfolded the deed, the bold letters catching what little light remained. This land, he said slowly, has been in my family for decades. The association line ends at that fence over there. He pointed toward the marker in the distance. You don't own this water, and you don't own me. The board members leaned closer, their expressions shifting from suspicion to unease. One of them muttered something about boundary maps, but Karen cut him off with a sharp glare. You think a piece of paper scares me? She snapped. But her voice lacked the same conviction it had before. The authority she wielded so easily at neighborhood meetings seemed fragile now, hollow in the face of undeniable proof. Carl finally pushed himself off the truck, walking slowly toward the group. His boots crunched against the gravel, each step heavy with intent. Looks pretty clear to me, Carl said, his voice low but carrying. You're barking up the wrong tree, lady. Karen turned, her composure unraveling, but the veteran's calm stare was unshakable. Daniel didn't press further. He didn't have to. The silence around them grew heavier than any shouting match could have been. Mark and Lisa stood frozen, eyes darting between the two sides, waiting for the breaking point. Karen's lips tightened. "This isn't over," she hissed, but the words sounded less like a threat and more like an excuse. Karen's fury was almost theatrical. Her face twisted, eyes darting between Daniel's calm demeanor and the silent board members who were no longer backing her with the same energy. She tightened her grip on the clipboard until her knuckles turned pale. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice low, teeth clenched. "Nobody makes a fool of me in my own community." Daniel lowered the paper but kept his gaze steady. "It's not your community. It's ours. And you don't get to decide who belongs here." The words carried weight, echoing louder than the crickets in the grass or the soft lap of water against the dock. For a moment, it felt like time froze. Karen's eyes flickered with something almost like fear, though she quickly masked it with another glare. She turned toward the board members, desperate for backup. "Say something. He can't just." But they didn't. Their silence was damning. One shifted uncomfortably, scribbling on his clipboard more for show than substance. The other stared at the ground, unwilling to meet Daniel's eyes. Carl's chuckle broke the tension like a gunshot. "Looks like you've lost your audience, ma'am." Karen whipped her head toward him, fury renewed. But Carl just shrugged, arms crossed again. His calm was infuriating, and she knew it. The standoff had reached its peak. The battle lines were drawn, and for once, Karen stood without her usual crowd of enforcers. The tension snapped when Karen spun on her heel, storming off toward the subdivision. Her footsteps pounded against the gravel, each one echoing with the frustration of a battle she hadn't won. Daniel remained still, shoulders squared, watching her retreat. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. Victory wasn't about celebration. It was about standing firm when it mattered most. Carl leaned back against his truck with a satisfied nod. "Told you, son. Bullies don't like being called out." Daniel exhaled slowly, folding the deed again and tucking it safely into his pocket. His guests looked at him with a mix of awe and relief. Lisa whispered, "I thought she was going to throw us out." "She tried," Daniel replied quietly. "But she doesn't get to decide anymore." The lake reflected the fiery sky, calm again now that the storm had passed. Yet the air still carried the weight of what had just happened. Everyone knew Karen would be back. She wasn't the kind of woman to accept defeat gracefully. But for tonight, the water was still, the dock was theirs, and the lake belonged, undeniably, to Daniel. Darkness settled gently over the lake, the last streaks of color fading into twilight. Daniel sat on the dock with Mark and Lisa, the three of them sharing a silence that said more than words could. The tension had drained from their shoulders, replaced by quiet reflection. Carl lingered by his truck, keeping a watchful eye on the path Karen had taken back toward the neighborhood. He'd seen this kind of fight before, not with clipboards and bylaws, but with men who didn't know when to quit. "She'll come back," Carl muttered when Daniel joined him later. "People like her don't let go. But she showed her hand tonight. She's rattled. That's when they make mistakes." Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. He knew Carl was right. The HOA wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. But tonight had shifted the balance. For the first time, Karen's control had faltered, and everyone saw it. As the crickets sang louder and the water mirrored the stars, Daniel felt a calm resolve settle over him. He wasn't just defending his land anymore. He was standing up for the right to live free from someone else's grip. The lake belonged to him, and no paper, no rule, no angry neighbor could change that. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, as though the storm of the previous night had never happened. Sunlight glimmered across the water, painting the lake in hues of gold. Daniel stood on the dock, shoulders loose, gaze calm. Mark and Lisa were already laughing on the grass, their picnic blanket spread once more. It felt almost normal. Almost. Then Karen appeared. Her steps were sharp, each one striking the gravel with the force of her anger. The clipboard was clutched tight against her chest, as though it could shield her pride. She had returned, as Carl predicted, and she looked ready for war. Carl leaned against his truck, arms folded, saying nothing. His silence was a steadying presence, a reminder that Daniel wasn't alone. Karen stopped just short of the dock. Her chin lifted, her tone colder than the morning air. Enjoy it while you can. We're filing formal charges. You've humiliated me, and you'll answer for it. Daniel let her words hang in the air. Then, slowly, he nodded. Do what you have to do. But this lake is mine, and nothing you file will change that. For the first time, Karen seemed rattled before the fight even began. The calm certainty in Daniel's voice was unshakable, and the witnesses around him, friends, allies, neighbors, were proof she no longer held control. Karen's reinforcements arrived moments later. The same two board members, looking weary and uncertain. They had been dragged back into the conflict, and their hesitation showed in the way they avoided eye contact with Daniel. Daniel unfolded the deed once more, holding it with calm precision. The paper, simple and unassuming, carried more power than all of Karen's threats combined. He raised it so they could see, then pointed toward the property marker in the distance. This is the line, he said evenly, and this lake falls inside it. Not the HOA's, not Karen's, mine. The two men exchanged glances, uncomfortable. One finally cleared his throat. He has a point, Karen. The map supports his claim. We shouldn't. Silence. Karen snapped, rounding on them. Her voice was sharp enough to cut, but it only highlighted her desperation. You're supposed to stand with me. This community needs order, and he's undermining everything. Carl chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Order doesn't mean control, he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. Karen's fury faltered, but she pressed on. Yet with every passing second, the authority she once commanded slipped further through her fingers. Daniel didn't need to raise his voice. His truth was stronger than her anger, and everyone there could feel it. Karen's face burned crimson, her fury bubbling over. You think you've won? This is bigger than you. I'll take this to the highest authority. You'll be buried under so much paperwork you'll wish you never owned this land. Daniel didn't move. His gaze was steady, his stance unyielding. You can bury me in papers, Karen, but it won't change the truth. This lake isn't yours to control. You've wasted enough of everyone's time pretending it was. The board members shifted uneasily, caught between the two forces. One finally spoke, voice trembling but firm. Karen, maybe it's time we step back. We've pushed this too far. The words hung in the air like a gavel strike. Carl's grin widened just slightly, his satisfaction plain. Karen's glare darted between them. Daniel, calm and firm, and the men who no longer stood at her side. Her clipboard shook in her hand, trembling not from strength, but from the weight of defeat. For the first time, her voice wavered. This isn't fair, she muttered, barely audible. It was not the declaration of a leader, but the complaint of someone who knew the battle was lost. The standoff ended not with a bang, but with silence. Karen turned sharply, her shoes crunching against the gravel as she stormed away. Her back was rigid, her steps uneven, as though the ground itself resisted her retreat. Daniel stood tall, watching her go. He didn't feel triumph in the usual sense. There was no joy in humiliating someone, only the quiet relief of knowing the fight was over. Carl gave a low whistle. That's the sound of a queen losing her crown, he said, amused. Mark and Lisa exchanged relieved smiles, settling back onto their blanket. The lake shimmered behind them, serene once again, as if reflecting the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. Daniel breathed deeply, the fresh air filling his lungs. This wasn't just about him. Karen's control had spread over the neighborhood for too long, and by standing his ground, he had reminded everyone that her power wasn't absolute. Karen vanished around the bend, her clipboard clutched like a lifeline. The board members followed at a distance, their expressions heavy with resignation. And just like that, the lakeside returned to peace. The day settled into calm, the sun high above, the lake glittering as though rewarding its rightful owner. Daniel sat with Mark and Lisa on the dock, their laughter carrying across the water. For the first time in weeks, the air felt light again. Carl remained by his truck, arms folded, his gaze softer than usual. You handled yourself well, son. Didn't let her push you around. That's how you keep what's yours. Daniel nodded, his thoughts quiet but resolute. He had stood his ground not with fists or anger, but with truth. The deed in his pocket was more than a legal document now. It was a symbol of freedom, of resilience against overreach. Karen's shadow would linger in the neighborhood, of that he had no doubt. But she had been broken in this fight, her control shattered in front of everyone who once followed her unquestioningly. The lake rippled softly, reflecting the sky. It was more than water and land. It was home. It was legacy. And now, undeniably, it was his. Daniel smiled faintly as a breeze swept across the water. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The battle with the HOA was over. The land was his. The freedom was his. And nothing, not Karen, not her board, not any piece of paper, could take it away again. If you enjoyed this intense story, smash that like button and subscribe for more gripping, cinematic tales. Don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss the next thriller. Your support keeps these stories coming.